were Wilson, Keppel and Betty? Regarded as one of the UK's best speciality acts, it's a complicated story, and like many tales of the stars of music hall and variety, shrouded in contradictions and myth. Here to help shed some light on this wonderful story is the author of the biography, Too Naked for the Nazis, published by Phantom, which tells the true story of Wilson, Keppel and Betty. I'd like you to welcome Alan Stafford. Yeah, how's lockdown treating you?
Well, obviously, the first thing I did was build a bookshelf and fill it with books so that I was ready to do things like this, because it's very important to have the right background.
It is. I think the books in the bookcase behind you are most certainly the right way to be. I mean, it's certainly becoming. You can tell a lot about people by their bookcases behind them. I haven't got one, unfortunately, because I can't be in that room. But I think you've got a mighty impressive bookcase behind you there, Alan. That's a good start of a 10, I think.
Yeah, I've just got to read.
So we'll start off. I've got a really simple question to start off with. Who were Wilson, Keppel and Betty?
Well, they were what you'd call a variety speciality act. You know, in the days of first music hall and then variety, you had a bill of all kinds of acts. You'd have your big names. You'd have your singers and your the big stars, if you like, and then you'd have the support acts. And you see it a lot on Britain's Got Talent now. The ventriloquists, magicians, acrobats, all of that type of thing. And I always loved watching that kind of thing. But the names that kept coming back as possibly the archetypal speciality act was Wilson, Keppel and Betty. And I think it's just one of those things where whenever you get a picture in the paper or on Twitter of three people, someone always says, "Oh, is that Wilson, Keppel and Betty?" You know, if they're three politicians or whatever, but, you know, preferably three idiots. It's a name that seems to have lasted, and it starts so, you know, Wilson, Keppel and Betty, you know, and there's always that slight twist to the end. So it was a name I was always aware of, but also their act was has lasted for very strangely, because it's an Egyptian sand dancing act. Wilson and Keppel dress up in Egyptian gear, often with the fezzes or the long headdresses, and they do the sideways, that type of thing. If you get that. And I think people often thought, well, are they taking it seriously? You know, is it a send up or not? Because it seemed like, you know, they'd done their research. They'd gone to the Egyptian tombs and, you know, and this is obviously how Egyptians moved. But no, they were just a deadpan act. They played absolutely seriously. And everyone rolled about laughing. Yeah.
And you see it actually, when you think about it, actually, it's permeated into many forms of variety over the years. I mean, obviously they were the originals, but you saw it a lot on light entertainment through the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And, you know, there's sort of, you know, there's lots of inspiration that's been drawn, I think, from the act.
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. It was just that whole kind of visual thing about it. And you get people, I mean, one of the probably the most familiar kind of recreations of the act is in the middle of the Cleopatra sketch that Morecambe and Wise did with Glenda Jackson. And suddenly in the middle of it all, Eric Morecambe scatters some sand on the ground, and they do the little back and forth Wilson, Keppel and Betty dance, and it was. You know, it's only a few seconds, but the audience loves it. And actually, Morecambe and Wise shared a bill early in their career with Wilson, Keppel and Betty, so they'd seen them, they'd worked with them, so it was that first-hand experience they'd had.
What would you say? I mean, obviously, going back to the sort of start of their sort of their career, if you like, what would you say was the appeal of them?
Well, I mean, they started off, Wilson, Keppel, just as a double act, doing basically a tap dancing act. And it's very complicated because they actually met up in Australia after the First World War. Wilson was Liverpudlian. Joe Keppel was from Ireland, but they met in Australia in a circus, teamed up, did this act, then went to America and tried their hand in American vaudeville through much of the 1920s. And then they met up with this American chorus girl from Kansas called Betty Knox. And here they are. And they formed a trio. And actually, to start with, they were doing a quite elegant act. There they are, you know, top hat, and then they experimented a bit. And I think Betty was a huge influence on them. And it ended up that they just thought, well, why not? I think they were already doing a kind of sand dance, because sand dancing in American wasn't uncommon. And then that was how it ended up. The Egyptian costumes, and then they really that catapulted them to fame very, very quickly. And then they came over after hitting it big in American vaudeville. They came over to England and toured all over England, and with the variety theatres. And yeah, I mean, they actually came to England, and their first engagement was the London Palladium. So they were really kind of hitting it big.
And of course they took Europe as well after the UK. So it was America, UK, Europe. If I'm correct, I believe that Joseph Goebbels thought that they were indecent.
Yes, that is where Too Naked for the Nazis comes from, the title, really, because it was just before the Second World War, and they were performing in the Berlin Wintergarten, the variety theatre there, and Goering and Goebbels were in the audience, and yes, it was they said that the nudity was bad for the Nazi youth's morals. And you might have thought this was Betty just going a little bit too far, but actually it was Wilson and Keppel's bare legs that were the problem.
And by this time, if I'm probably right, the original Betty, so Betty Knox, had decided to sort of retire and step away from the original trio.
Yes, I mean, she really was, I think, a huge influence on them. You know, she really had helped shape every aspect of the act. After she left, I don't think they introduced a single new bit of business for the rest of their career. But she, well, obviously, male dancers can probably go on forever. Female dancers, their days are numbered. And I think she was getting a bit bored with it, because she was a very creative person. And she got a job as a journalist. And she didn't know particularly anything about being a journalist, but she'd toured all over the country, so she actually knew more about Britain than many kind of British journalists. So yes, so she worked for the London Evening Standard. She soon had her own column called Over Here, which was really educating the British about the American servicemen. And then when war broke out, she went to Normandy and reported back for the London Evening Standard from there. And I also have a picture of her in her war correspondence uniform. So that is what she went on to do, and again made a huge impact and success at that, while the name Betty was handed on to any number of other female dancers who took over.
And interestingly, in the Nazi, so there's a link again with Nazis, because wasn't she the first to report on Goebbels' death?
Yeah, Goering's death, actually.
Goering's
yes,
death, that's
right.
Correct, yes.
Hermann Goering, who had been in the audience when they had danced before them, And yes, she was reporting on the Nuremberg trials after the war, and she'd actually had a tip-off from a warder who she knew that Goering and Hermann Goering had committed suicide before he was due to be executed. And she wasn't absolutely sure that this rumor was genuine, and so she kind of missed out on it. And the papers said he'd been executed, and it, yeah, it wasn't a good time for her. I don't think she ever really, I think she was teased about it. She was, her reputation after that wasn't quite what it had been. But it was interesting to see it come full circle, and that, encountering Goering, first as a member of the audience, and then watching his trial.
And so, with Betty stepping away, they needed to clearly find a replacement. What sort of tack did they take?
Well, initially, more or less the first replacement for Betty was her daughter. She had a daughter, a very short-lived marriage, and a daughter who was back in America when Betty came over to England. Her daughter Patsy stayed in America, and she didn't see her for many years. And then just before the war, she went back to America, brought Patsy to England, not necessarily the safest place to be, really. And they actually kind of remained very close. And Patsy, for many years, was the new Betty, although they still called her Betty. And she was a different dancer. She was actually more acrobatic. Betty was a tap dancer. But no, she fitted well into the act. So it was very much a family affair.
Wasn't this a theme that continued? Because weren't there more of the women that came along and effectively became the third in the trio?
Yes, there were. I mean, there were. I think I've found about 14, 15, that kind of number, because, and it doesn't mean that they didn't get on particularly, but to do that act as you were doing twice nightly, kind of 6 days a week or whatever, after a while, you probably do get a bit fed up with it. And there were some very remarkable women. They often, if they were working in pantomime, they were a very good pantomime act, actually, because they were two-dimensional. Everything, because it was all kind of sideways and all that. In a pantomime, you needed a speciality act. So the curtain would come down, and while they were changing the scenery, you'd have the act in front of curtain. And then the curtains would go up, and you'd be back into the pantomime. Yes, yes, so that they had a busy act. They were never out of work. So some girls came and went, but there were a few that were important, and they often, when they did panto, they would, perhaps if they were ready to change the Betty, or the other one was ready to leave, they would look at the chorus and think, yes, she's got something special, and bring her into it. And they carried on through the 40s, the 50s, into the 60s, and the very last Betty actually became really very important. Someone from Jean Curley from Birmingham. She stayed with them from about 1956 to 62, and the men were getting old by then, and she basically got a van and would drive them everywhere, and help kind of getting all the props in and out. So she was a very, very important person in their later years.
And as part of the research, as I understand it, you've managed to speak to a couple of the actual Bettys themselves.
Yes. There was a very short-lived Betty who was. They actually worked with her. She was. She'd been in the army. She'd been a beauty queen, and they again picked her out of the chorus. She. They worked with her in pantomime at Hammersmith, and in the course of the pantomime, she met a trampolinist, fell in love, married him. And so by the time the pantomime ended, she was ready to well, basically go off and have a honeymoon, really. So they had to find someone else. But I spoke to her in America, and yeah, and I was in contact with the last Betty, and I also spoke to someone from Blackpool who'd actually taken over from the original Betty just before Betty's daughter joined the act. So it was wonderful to talk to people that really knew them firsthand.
It certainly helps with the research, and I mean, for you, for researching, I know that you're a stickler for detail. I've chatted to you already about your other book, the Crackerjack book, and I know you did an extensive amount of research for that. But I'm assuming that, you know, the whole process you sort of go through is quite extensive. Did you unearth any surprises during that research, would you say?
Well, I think the real surprise was Betty. I really was kind of building this up from tiny, tiny bits of information. But I think when I discovered that Betty, in her younger years, when she was growing up in Salina in Kansas, uh, she ran away from home a number of times, and she and there at one point there was a big kind of search for her. Her and a female friend had just run away. Basically, she'd been seeing this boy, and it all got very difficult, and so she ran away with this female friend, and they just kind of, you know, hitched rides on trains, and, you know, snuck into goods carriages. So so I think right from the start, she, you know, there was, I don't think she had any fear. That was basically it. So that's why it kind of explains a lot of her career. You know, she there was a strong, perhaps rebellious streak in her. So that yes, she wasn't afraid to just kind of think, right, let's go somewhere. So any kind of feeling of travel or anything else, or even into a war zone, I think she just treated it as an adventure.
It sounds like the whole Wilson, Keppel and Betty story is one big adventure from start to finish. It feels a bit like.
It is, and it was, you know, at the beginning when you're uncovering the story, you don't know if you've got anything or not. But yes, it certainly was. It was. I mean, it was a life packed with adventure. Certainly, you know, they were never out of work. Betty wasn't. Wilson and Keppel weren't for the whole of their career. They worked right to the end.
And what should people expect from the book?
Oh, I think, well, if they're like me, I think they're going to fall for Betty, because I think she, you know, there is so much about her. I mean, she is a forgotten character in a lot of ways. If you look up female war correspondents, she gets hardly a mention. But so I think, you know, you will learn a little about Wilson and Keppel, which is also interesting because they spent much of their career looking like twins in some ways. They're so identical, and personality-wise, they couldn't be more different, really. The one was outgoing, one was kind of quite quiet, one dressed smartly, one was just dressed like a tramp, really, when he was off stage. One ate and drank whatever he liked. The other one, you know, was always dieting, didn't touch alcohol. So it's quite interesting to see that these two people, they do have their own personalities.
Well, that I'm sure will be I'm sure that is an intriguing and very interesting read. Finally, Alan, what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment?
Oh, I am working on something. I don't think I will exactly say precisely what I'm working on. It's
Okay.
another kind of big project in a way, because I mean, Wilson, Keppel and Betty covers so much of the variety period because they worked from the 20s to the 60s. Crackerjack well, crackerjack still goes on, so the 50s through to now. The next thing I'm working on again is something. It's not TV, it's not theatre, but it covers a big range of time. That's all I will say.
Okay, well, we'll watch this space then, Alan, I think, by the sounds of that. Alan, I'd like to thank you for joining us to share some of the knowledge and insight that you've learned on Wilson, Keppel and Betty. It's been an interesting chat, and I'm sure anyone that looks to buy the book will have a very interesting read by the sounds of it. Alan, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.